Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Gosh, that's going quite very quickly, thank you. It's lovely well, it was lovely to see such a very distinguished audience and so buzzy and really nice. I can't see you at all now because the lights are completely on me. I usually walk around at the bottom, which is more comfortable for me. Could you please, at this point, turn off or to silent your mobile phones? It's awful to do when it starts ringing in your bag or pocket. So please check that you have put them on silent. Thank you. This is such a lovely evening. We love working with René Cassin. We've several times in the last 2 years we've had really good events, and of course this was originally planned for May, and we were very excited about it in the summer, and then the election was called, and we were told we couldn't run it, and thank goodness Keir agreed to come back in the autumn, and here we are. This is the first official week of the term here at JW3, and I hope if you aren't a regular visitor, then after this evening you want to become one, and you come to lots of things. We have one-off events, courses, classes, films, exercise, dance, and lots of other things, and I'm around at the end if you want to chat through any of that. It's now a great honour to introduce Mia Hassan-Gross, who is the director of René Cassin. Please give her a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Good evening and welcome to Keir Starmer in Conversation with Joe Coburn. I'm delighted to have both Keir and Joe here with us. As Judy mentioned, my name is Mia and I'm the director of René Cassin, the Jewish Voice for Human Rights. Next year, we will mark the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, arguably one of the biggest achievements of modern history, and one in which our namesake, Monsieur René Cassin, took a leading role. Unfortunately, 70 years on from 1943, and it's not looking so good for human rights, or liberalism, or internationalism for that matter. In June 2017, René Cassin brought together a panel of experts, some of which I see in the audience here tonight, and we all agreed that human rights today are under threat, and there is an urgent need to revisit the founding principles of human rights and forcibly make the case for their protection and promotion. And this is what we at René Cassin have committed to doing, to rebuild a human rights-centered narrative to ensure that future generations have human rights to defend. That is why I'm delighted to have Keir as our guest tonight. First, I was told that he prefers not to be referred to as Sir Keir, so I won't, but I had to plug it in. As I'm sure most people here in the room know, Keir is currently the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the EU, or in short, the Shadow Brexit Minister, and is known for his determination to hold the government to account over the terms for leaving the EU, asserting that security, transparency, and challenge are central tenets to our democracy. Keir has had what many would define as a meteoric rise for someone who only entered the Commons as MP for Holborn and St Pancras in 2015. But at a time when MPs are routinely criticised for narrowness of their experience, Keir had already had two successful and high-profile careers, both turning to politics. From 2000 to 2008 to 2013, he was Director of Public Prosecutions, a role that was sandwiched between two periods as a highly regarded human rights lawyer. And in July of this year, Keir was appointed as Privy Councillor. So thank you to Keir, who'll soon be joining us, for being with us tonight. I'm also delighted to introduce our chair for this evening's conversation, Joe Coburn. Joe is a journalist and political correspondent for BBC News and presenter of the BBC's daily politics programme. In a career spanning over 15 years, Joe has covered national elections in the UK and overseas, and events surrounding the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. She has also presented live audience debates leading to the 2015 and 2017 general elections. So for the next 40 to 45 minutes, we'll be privy to a conversation between Joe and Keir about Brexit, human rights, the Jewish community, and everything in between. Following the conversation, there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions, so I hope you came well prepared, before closing remarks from Simone Abel, a trustee of Reneka San. So all I can do is wish you a pleasant evening.
Please now give a huge welcome to Keir Starmer and Joe Coburn.
Lovely comfy armchairs, I have to say, probably more comfy than yours, but do bear with us for the next hour and a half. Welcome. It's so good to see so many of you here this evening, and it's very nice to see Keir Starmer, although I see quite a lot of him, it has to be said, in his role as the Shadow Brexit Secretary. I promised him we won't spend the whole evening talking about Brexit, because this is supposed to be a broad discussion about human rights, but of course Brexit is going to make an appearance. And as I think I heard Mia saying, you of course will have your opportunity to put questions to Keir later on. So let's start on the issue of human rights and the law. Your other life, your previous life, I suppose your former life, it stays with you forever, I'm sure. And let's talk about the impact of the Second World War, the horrors of the Holocaust, the persecution of Jews and other minorities that led to modern-day human rights being developed. How important has the Jewish experience been in your mind in the development of those human rights?
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for having me. That question goes to the heart of my whole interest in human rights, because I devoted my years as a lawyer, as an advocate to human rights. And what happened after the Second World War was not the creation of human rights, but a real turning point in human rights. There had been human rights protections before the Second World War, but afterwards the world sort of came together in horror, recognising the full horror of everything that happened, and made a number of vows to each other about a number of things, including human rights. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was and is the founding instrument, was an attempt to do two fundamental and profound things for human rights. The first is to say human rights are universal, absolutely universal, and that principle must never be broken. We never categorise, in terms of human rights, different groups, different individuals. And the second thing, and this is not always appreciated so much, was that what also changed was the notion that the enforcer of human rights is not just the nation state, but that states are responsible to each other for the way that they treat their own citizens. Because what the awful experience of the Second World War and what went before the Second World War showed was that in some cases laws were passed to enable things to happen, and other states outside felt it was none of their business to say anything about what was happening in another state. So it was, one, a list of universal standards, genuinely universal. Secondly, a vow that each state was accountable to other states for their own human rights protections and violations. And that principle was completely new. And that's why when people now rail against the European Court of Human Rights, etc., they fundamentally fail to understand one of the core principles that was put in place at the end of the Second World War.
But had those human rights laws that developed in the wake of the Second World War really succeeded in protecting communities around the world? And you only have to think of two major examples over the last 50 or 60 years or so, when you think of the genocide in Rwanda and you think of the Bosnian genocide as constituted by the UN. Where were human rights laws then?
Well, if you measure the success of human rights against a yardstick which there cannot be any violation or gross violations, then on that level there's obviously a huge amount more that needs to be done, because we have seen some horrors. And genocide, the crime of all crimes, deliberately made the most important and most serious global crime, has been committed since 1948, when the Universal Declaration was put in place. And there's no denying that. On the other hand, there have been or has been, a gradual improving of standards around the world. Human rights have been built into constitutions around the world, enforceable rights are there, and in foreign policy, etc., on occasion and importantly, human rights have been the framework within which foreign policy has been carried out. So if measured against some of the atrocities, then obviously human rights violations have not been prevented. But I think we are in a better world because of human rights and the way that they have provided the framework within which we can gauge what others do.
In terms of international human rights and the setting up of courts in The Hague or United Nations or in New York or in Geneva, has there been the development of institutions that are now too remote, that don't really impact on ordinary citizens' lives, that the bid to try and, as you say, bind nations together in a supranational collective or just keep an eye on other countries, has it actually failed to deal with the human rights at a national level?
I think there are a number of different answers to that question because the courts are, in some respects, different. If you look at the Rwanda tribunal, that was important because with genocide and crimes against humanity, there has been a really important attempt to say to the world, if you commit these crimes, you will never be free from those that will come after you and seek to prosecute you for the rest of your life. And those crimes have got no time limit on them, and these institutions were set up in order to try to send a very powerful message about accountability, that wherever you may be, wherever these crimes are committed, they are never statute barred, they're never over, and eventually people will be brought to trial. And that was a very, very important and significant piece of what's happened in recent decades. For courts like the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, there's obviously a different feel, that's a permanent institution. And I don't think we've actually communicated the importance of those institutions as well as we could and should have done, and I think most people therefore don't see those courts as upholding their rights when they should see them as upholding their rights.
So would you agree that today the issue of human rights is often painted by politicians and the media as being in opposition to the interests of ordinary people because it is seen as the preserve so often of foreign criminals or asylum seekers or refugees, and in the end that has deemed, as I say, remote to other citizens?
Yes, and that's particularly powerful in the UK. There's no shared ownership of human rights, and it is quite extraordinary that there's even talk of repealing, for example, the Human Rights Act. In most countries, in many countries, you only get a constitution with human rights in it or a Human Rights Act when there's been a battle of some sort and people feel something's been given to me which really matters to me because I've now got a set of tools I can use against the state to stop them infringing my rights and their constitutional documents. We have this absurd situation in this country where no sooner do we have a Human Rights Act than there's a clamour to give it all back up again and pass it up. That's so counterintuitive, to give human rights to the general population and then have a debate about whether they should be handed back to the state. But that is, I think, a failure of the moment. The Human Rights Act was born very quickly after the 1997 Labour government. The Act came, but there wasn't the movement around it to support it, and then it got tested in the most extreme circumstances. So the Human Rights Act got royal assent in October 2000, and within months you had 9/11. And so instead of a human rights instrument that could settle down and be used in particular ways, it went straight into a battle against some of the provisions that were then put in place to deal with terrorism. And I think that's meant it's been very, very difficult in the UK, in particular, to have the right conversation about human rights.
But does the issue of human rights, in the way you've just described it, put allegiance to international institutions ahead of a nation state? Does it override national culture and demean a sense of national pride?
I don't think it demeans a sense of national pride. It is intended to override. These are supposed to be global standards that apply across all nations. I mean, the absurd thing, of course, about this whole discussion in our country is, as everybody knows, the rights that were put into the Universal Declaration and particularly into the European Convention on Human Rights were rights which we, the British, had a great hand in drafting. And at that moment after the Second World War, those involved in crafting these instruments genuinely thought that they were putting into some form the values that they had just fought the war on. And the reason we never incorporated the European Convention on Human Rights into our law was not so much we didn't believe in it, it's just that we thought we didn't need it. This was to protect others, other countries that didn't. We were going to bestow on them the sort of values that we had, but we didn't need them ourselves because they were our values. And so it's very curious now to get to the early 21st century where they're seen as aliens, something different, overriding our culture. If anything, these rights in particular were supposed to embody everything that we believed in.
Right, but that dislocation, do you think, did that lay the ground for a Brexit referendum campaign where experts and elites became a dirty word, including judges and international human rights?
I think that was certainly part of what went on last year. I'm not sure we fully unpicked what happened on June the 23rd last year in the referendum, because I don't think it was a narrow question that people felt they were answering. Are you in favour of remaining in the EU or leaving? Behind that technical question, I think people saw much bigger questions about themselves, their communities, their lives. And that phrase, take back control, which I really hated in the referendum campaign.
But it worked.
But it really worked. It really worked. It was a Heineken phrase. It got into lots of different people in different ways and spoke to them about something profound about influence and control. And when asked the question, do you think you've got enough control or influence over your own lives, people started saying, actually, no. And that was sometimes economic, because people felt that they hadn't had a pay rise, their employment situation wasn't as secure as it was. But it wasn't all economic. It spoke to different communities. I think lots of regions, particularly away from London, were looking down on London and thinking that's where all the power is and the wealth and the infrastructure. I don't feel it in my community. There was a huge distrust of politicians, experts, judges, you name it, because people felt remote and asked the question, have you got control or influence? They looked at people like me and thought, you're too remote, I can't do very much to influence you. And they looked at their changing communities and asked themselves, do I have enough control and influence over it? And I think because now we are all so focused on what is the deal that has to be struck with the EU, and rightly so, we are missing the opportunity to really pick over what that referendum told us about the state of the nation, and that sense of remoteness, disenfranchisement, lack of influence, I think, is something that spoke very, very strongly, very, very loudly, and we have to attend to the project which is actually addressing some of those structural core concerns that people had.
One of the big complaints about that campaign is that on both sides people were accused of putting forward myths and lies and promises. Is one of those myths that leaving the EU would result in a reduction in the level of human rights protection enjoyed by people in the UK?
I think that's a profound question. And I don't think the answer lies in, are we going to pull away from the Charter on Fundamental Rights, which the government wants to pull away from? Is it a challenge to the European Convention of Human Rights?
Because we'd still be bound by that.
We would. It's more profound than that. And I campaigned and voted to remain. And I did it because I believe in internationalism, in cooperation and collaboration, and that standards and regulations that provide a level playing field, whether it's at work or environmental, etc., are important and should be supported. Many of those that campaigned to leave did it because they saw a different Britain, a deregulated Britain, a free trade, low tax Britain. They are ideologically two different things. And many of those that campaigned to leave ideologically were driven in that direction. That is the biggest threat, this idea of pulling away. And on the morning of the 24th, I actually sat with my young children. I've got a 6-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. I just had a private moment with them, and I thought to myself, what sort of world are you going to grow up in? Is it going to be? I mean, I wasn't talking about a single mum customs union. We've all got that.
Excited for your 6 and 9.
Everybody's got a favourite model now of what they want going forward. I was just thinking about something really profound, which is, are they going to grow up in a world unlike the world I have enjoyed, where the UK pulls away from the international stage, tries to strip away from international obligations and commitments, turns in on itself and becomes less tolerant of others, and the sort of mindset of the country changes. And that's the biggest threat. It's not actually a particular instrument, it's the mindset of a nation. And in the last 2 years, the mindset of the nation has been challenged profoundly. I grew up advocating human rights. I've been working in different countries on human rights. I never thought that what I thought were norms embedded since the Second World War would be challenged in the way they've been challenged in the last 2 years. And that's the profound challenge of Brexit.
But is the EU perfect in upholding those human rights when the challenge of refugees coming in boats on an almost daily basis, making dangerous crossings, many of them dying at sea, and the EU response was limited at best and actually counterproductive and probably meant that more people could have died at sea? Was that upholding human rights in the way that you would expect?
No, and the EU's made all sorts of mistakes on human rights, and there's nothing perfect about the EU, and nor should any of us who wanted to remain in it suggest otherwise. There are plenty of things wrong with it, but the question is, if you look at the profound challenges in the world, and the refugee crisis, the biggest refugee crisis since the Second World War, is one of those challenges, and ask yourself the question, are we more likely to solve that challenge individually as countries or collectively as a group of countries? There's only one answer to that.
But Germany, under Angela Merkel, she was hailed a heroine by so many for saying that she would open the doors to Germany to 1 million Syrian refugees. She did that as a nation state. She did that on her own. She didn't do that as part of the EU. So in what way are countries not able to make the generous offer, as some people saw it, that she made on Syrian refugees?
Well, she did make a generous offer, and the offer went beyond the international obligations. As you know, the obligation is that if someone as an asylum seeker actually arrives in your country, then you have international obligations to them. She went a step further than that, saying, notwithstanding you haven't actually arrived in my country, we will allow you to arrive and to treat you with the respect and dignity that you need. So that went over and above what was necessary. But contrast that with our own position. We in the UK did as little as humanly possible in response to the refugee crisis. And I went over to the camps in Calais when I was Shadow Immigration Minister, and got the Eurostar from St Pancras to Calais. It takes about an hour. Got off and saw the most appalling conditions, with kids in tents, in the slush, in the freezing cold, the same age as my children, living out a horror. And I left them as it got dark. I got on the train, came back to St Pancras, went to Kentish Town, looked in on my kids who were sleeping in a warm bed. The only difference being they were born in a different place. And we then pushed on, as you know, to have the Al-Dub scheme, which would have allowed children to come to this country, children, unaccompanied children. And the government fought us all the way. And no sooner had they agreed a scheme than they cancelled it again earlier this year. So we have used our ability, as it were, standing on the edge of Europe, to say unless somebody's reached our shore, we feel we have no responsibility at all, and we're not going to do anything about it.
But human rights are complicated, aren't they?
Yeah.
And whose human rights are more important? Because there has been an argument put forward that since Angela Merkel opened her doors in the way that you say Britain did not, it wasn't part of an international agreement in that sense, we have seen the rise of Alternative for Deutschland, an anti-immigrant party, some might even call them neo-Nazis, back in the Bundestag for the first time. And many people say they support AfD because they feel their human rights are being overridden by the rights of refugees.
And we have to absolutely push back against that. I mean, the rise of the right in Germany, of all countries, is shocking on every level. It was very high this time last year. It began to dwindle in the early part of this year, and I rather hope that was a sort of downward trend, and then I was pretty shocked to see it come back up again in this general election. And we have to push back against that, and it's not a question of competing rights. It is back to the principle that the rights are universal. The way they operate is really important, and I'm not sure everybody always gets this concept. Almost all human rights instruments distinguish between some rights which are absolute and some rights which are qualified, and they are treated differently. So the right to life, the right to be not to be tortured, are absolute rights. There are no circumstances in which you can take someone's life in an arbitrary fashion. There are no circumstances in which you can torture someone or subject them to inhuman treatment. They're absolute. There is no balancing to be done. Other rights, whether it's free speech, free movement, freedom of assembly, are balanced. You can do so much, but there comes a point at which the rights of others have to be taken into account to put a framework around what you can do. And so actually human rights are carefully calibrated and separated into different categories, and that all gets lost in the mix, I think, when we talk about human rights.
But can you then understand the anger and frustration with lawyers using human rights legislation to protect Islamic hate preachers, for example, from being deported to their country of origin because there might be the risk, however small, of them being tortured?
I understand how that debate goes, but in the end it's fundamental. The circumstances in which you can't be deported are where there's a real risk, not just a likelihood, a real risk that you're going to be killed in an arbitrary way, or a real risk that you're going to be tortured or subject to ill treatment, of a very high level. And the question we have to ask ourselves as a state is, are we the sort of country that does send people off to their death or send them off to be tortured? And how can we square that with the prohibition on arbitrary killing and the prohibition on torture? And the answer is we can't and we shouldn't do it. What's really interesting is, although there are one or two dubious examples, there aren't very many examples where Britain has ever actually done that. It wasn't the Human Rights Act. I mean, people say it's all the fault of the Human Rights Act. Before that, we were merrily sending people off to be killed or tortured with a sort of daily Home Office letter. I mean, most Home Secretaries never did it. Never. It was an unwritten British rule that you didn't send people off to be killed and you didn't send people off to be tortured. There are some examples that people argue about whether that was absolutely adhered to, but actually search through several decades, and I challenge people to identify Home Secretaries of both parties who've actually done that. It's something which we've never really done as a nation, and that's not. I mean, people say it was all the fault of the Human Rights Act. Get rid of that, and we could get back to the good old days. But those days didn't exist actually in this country, not for decades and decades and decades.
So how did you feel under Tony Blair? You referred to post 9/11 and the so-called war on terror, and the fact that there was a massive debate around detention without charge and control orders that were brought in by a Labour government. Were they necessary in order to protect the rights of people living here?
Well, of course, I was outside of politics then.
That's an excuse.
I mean, it gives me a number of different perspectives on it. On the first place, I had very serious questions about the legality of what was happening in Iraq and other places in the first place. And I was critical of the measures that Tony Blair and others introduced to deal with the threat of terrorism, which was real. The indefinite detention was unlawful, and it was challenged and found to be unlawful, and rightly so. It didn't follow from that nothing must be done. And the question is whether then, in different circumstances, you could control people by putting conditions on what they could do. Now, I've represented quite a number of people on control orders, because if you're on a control order, you can challenge whether you're on a control order. But there are two bases for a control order, or one of the TPIMs which have now taken their place. The first is the government must show it is necessary to take those measures against you. In other words, there is such a high risk associated to the individual that something must be done, and then they've got to show that what is done is proportionate, whether it's saying you've got to stay at home between these hours, whether you've got to wear a tag, whatever it may be. And having represented some of the people who are on control orders, I have to say I've got little doubt that measures had to be taken in relation to some of those individuals. I have no doubt at all. Having then gone from being a human rights advocate to being Director of Public Prosecutions, and having worked closely with the Security and Intelligence Service, so having
You changed your mind?
No, I didn't change my mind, because I mean, actually, you know, I would have been hard pushed with the people I was representing to say no measures should be taken. We are very often arguing that the particular measures were disproportionate. The argument that nothing needed to be done was quite hard in those cases, and the court then analysed whether it was necessary to have a measure, and they usually found that it was. Having then worked with Security and Intelligence Services, it became even clearer to me that you have to have some measures available to you to deal with individuals who are at risk. The question is, what do you do and how long can you have those measures in place? One of the problems with control orders was that they became repetitive and people were on them for a very, very long time, and so you weren't moving the situation on. But I've never, ever argued that some of those measures were not actually necessary. I think I've always believed they were.
Right. But
and I still believe that.
And how far do you go with that? Because now we're talking about terrorism, let's sort of delve a little deeper, because the threat of terrorism is very real. We have suffered at the hands of terrorists directly. We suffered from it to some extent under when the IRA was around, but now we are suffering from it in a way here, homegrown to some extent. And is there an argument to say we should now be restricting the human rights of terror suspects, of which the government routinely says there are around 3,000 of varying degrees of threat level, in order to avoid a repeat of the Manchester bombing?
Yeah, I mean, this was an argument that Theresa May ran in this general election campaign, that one of her pledges was to change the Human Rights Act so that more people could be deported, exactly the conversation we've just been having. In my view, she completely missed the point and misunderstands the current threat. The current threat is not so much how do we control known suspects, it's what do we do about the fact that we don't even know who the suspects are. It is a profoundly more difficult threat, and to pretend that you solve the difficulty we're now in by more draconian measures against known suspects is actually to focus on completely the wrong solution. The big question now is, how on earth do we get the information we need on the people we need it on in time to do something about it? If we actually knew the identities of the individuals in the first place, that would be one thing, but it's a very, very different. I mean, terrorism comes in different shapes and forms, and the form it's in at the moment is a very, very challenging form, because this homegrown, arbitrary approach to terrorism makes the job of the Security and Intelligence Services fiendishly difficult. And actually, what I thought the Prime Minister should have concentrated on is, how do we address the problem we're actually confronting? Not how do I play to a sort of gallery of people who just want to hear about deporting people to death or torture or whatever it may be.
But is it just about deporting people? And politics is politics. It's a rough old game, as you know, and everyone is playing to their audience. But in the framework of human rights, as I say, isn't there an argument on privacy, on surveillance powers? Wouldn't people be prepared to give up, or some people be prepared to give up, an aspect of civil liberties in order to allow the security services to, yes, go on fishing expeditions, or to be able to restrict the online activities of people who are on their watch lists?
Yeah, I mean, the privacy is a classic example of a qualified right. We all want our privacy. We guard it jealously, and the idea of somebody looking at some of our more private moments, wherever they are, fills us with horror. We equally want the police and security intelligence service to have complete access to anyone who presents as a suspect or a risk or a danger. So we want absolute privacy for ourselves and no privacy for suspects. And that's very human, that's understandable, and we therefore concern ourselves if there's any attempt to impinge on our privacy, which of course is not necessary, rather than concentrating on those whose privacy should be impinged. The problem is that you don't know someone's a suspect till they're a suspect. And I'll give you just one example of that when I was DPP that I hope brings it to life. We had, when I was DPP, a horrible case of a young girl, aged 6, who was abducted and disappeared. We had police and family and friends and many other people out searching in the immediate days afterwards. There was a breakthrough and somebody was arrested, and we didn't have a lot of evidence on him. And nobody knew whether the girl was alive or dead. And we needed to know, fast. And therefore it was imperative that the police were able to search through everything that this individual had in terms of any data, any emails, any social media. Is there any way of finding out who he's in contact with, where he might have gone, where he might have put this poor girl, whether she can be found, and the only way that, and we did do that, the only way that was possible is because of the powers that are available to require that data to be preserved. And we searched through that. I mean, unfortunately and tragically, she was already dead, but he was not known to be a suspect until he was actually arrested. And when people say, why don't you just focus on people and infringe their privacy when they're a suspect? Well, that's fine, but you don't know before they're a suspect, and you'd have to be a pretty hardened protector of privacy to say that you wouldn't support a regime that allowed the security intelligence forces or the police to look into the tank of communications that is the tank of everyone's communications when they need to do so. And there are many versions and examples of that, I'm afraid, and that's the trade-off that has to be made, and it's not always comfortable.
Right, and in terms of that trade-off, let's move on to politics and how politicians compromise their belief in human rights. If we go back to the migrant crisis briefly, as you say, it's been one of the biggest challenges since the Second World War. And a deal was done with Turkey, not known for its great record on human rights, necessarily. And yet, it was convenient for the EU to do that deal with Turkey because it stemmed the flow of migrants that were causing so many problems. Is that a trade-off that's worth making on human rights?
There are always going to be trade-offs that have to be carefully managed and balanced, and it comes up in different shapes and forms. It may come up with refugees, in the example of Turkey that you've given. It also comes up when questions are raised as to who can you share your data with when you're trying to track terrorist activities, because if we as a nation said we will only cooperate with countries that fully comply with all human rights in exactly the way we do, then there'll be a lot of information we can't have which we wouldn't have. So it's about how you get the balance right. Equally, when I was DPP, we were working with other countries to try to sort of build and reinforce their ability to have the rule of law and to have due process, but you started sometimes from a pretty low base in terms of what was going on in those countries. And the question we had to ask ourselves is it legitimate for us even to go to these countries and work with people? And it's a question of degree, but to some extent you have to work out whether in the end you're going to improve the general situation of human rights protection across the world by working with other nations or not. And it's not always easy to answer that in the abstract. If you simply say we'll never have anything to do with any country that doesn't fully comply in every respect with every human rights instrument, then that makes life very difficult when it comes to very serious risks.
Right, although you don't necessarily have to talk about not having anything to do with these countries, but actually signing deals and treaties in the name of trade or business, it becomes difficult, doesn't it, for political parties, if we take the example of the Conservatives and Saudi Arabia, or the Labour Party's inability to condemn Maduro's regime in Venezuela for its human rights abuses, because politically it's difficult.
It's made overly difficult. I actually think that all of us should get a bit more backbone and actually call a spade. I mean, that's because I've only been in it 2 years. I mean,
You'll change.
It feels like I've been in a long time. I only became an MP in 2015. So and having spent my whole life as a human rights advocate, I don't have as much difficulty with others saying, well, that looks to me like a human rights violation, and we should call it a human rights violation and decide what we're going to do about it.
So why does the Labour Party find it so difficult to condemn certain regimes and not others?
Well, we shouldn't do any more than any other party should do. I mean, we should be open if there are human rights abuses. We should say so.
When it comes to dealings with America and Donald Trump, do you think there is a risk there of facing both ways? You just said yourself we have to deal with countries, which is correct, particularly one that we say we have a special relationship with. But then, how do you deal with the events that have unfolded in America with travel bans or attempted travel bans on people from certain countries, which President Obama also did to a more limited extent? Are you able to call those out?
Two things there. Firstly, we do deal with the Americans a lot. And when it comes to counter-terrorism, we do share a lot of information in real time. And we've done that for very many years, and it is vital that we continue to be able to do that. Does that prevent us calling out the actions of President Trump? I don't think so. I mean, I was very struck by the fact that Angela Merkel, and Germany of course shares information with America just the same way that we do, felt much more able to call out some of what President Trump was doing in a way that our Prime Minister did not. And she set the framework from the very start, saying, this is the framework within which I will deal with you. These are our values, and we will do it within the framework of those values. Our Prime Minister took a political decision not to do that and not have that backbone. And I don't think it's done her any good.
But returning to the issue of political allies, President Trump was rightly condemned for using the phrase, or condemning violence on all sides was the expression that he used during the riots in Charlottesville, comparing white supremacists and their actions, some of whom backed his campaign, no doubt, with the actions of anti-racists. And isn't that when it becomes very difficult for politicians and their supposed allies?
Well, it becomes very difficult, but people have to be brave about it and call it out. But I mean, if you go down the slippery slope of saying, well, because this regime is supportive, or this group of people are supportive, we will not call out what we see in front of us, then that is a slippery slope, and I don't think politicians should go down that slope.
Do you think the Labour Party has called out anti-Semitism enough? Has it been brave enough to deal with what has been an ongoing problem now for the last few years?
I think it's been a huge challenge for the Labour Party, and it saddens me that we are having a discussion and have had a discussion over the last few years about anti-Semitism and the Labour Party. The idea that that is the subject of a discussion. I've said on a number of occasions, I don't think we've called it out quick enough and loudly enough. I'm pleased that we've now had a rule change at the recent party conference which strengthens the position. I'm pleased there's a discussion about a wider definition of anti-Semitism, and changing the rules, having a faster response is really important. But what's even more important is changing the culture in any organisation, because no organisation, no institution should be anti-Semitic or tolerate it in any way, and that includes the Labour Party. So there's almost no good that has come out of the last 2 or 3 years of this discussion about Labour and anti-Semitism, apart from the fact that it's come out and has forced the position in relation to a rule change. Good step in the right direction. What now needs to follow is a cultural change that actually means anti-Semitism is simply not tolerated anywhere. And I just want to say 2 more things about that, because I know it's important and be very important to this audience. When any institutional organisation says we have zero tolerance, those words need to mean something. And those words, zero tolerance means that we take a very strong, almost disproportionate action in response to it in order to show how unacceptable it is. Zero tolerance means absolutely not. And it's used in other contexts in that way. And so zero tolerance is not just a couple of words, it's actually really, really important to how you change things. And the second is, in terms of changing the culture, is making people feel differently about being in the Labour Party. And I had someone in my own constituency who's Jewish just take me aside and just say, can I just talk you through what it feels like for me to be in some of our party meetings? And she said, I just sit there and I know at some stage the question of Israel and aspects of anti-Semitism will come up, and it makes me inhibited from taking any part in the meeting, whether it's about that or anything else, and I don't want to be there because I fear it will come up, and therefore I don't come. And it was a really, really important insight into how the culture has to change in such a way that people genuinely feel comfortable in the environment that is the Labour Party. So, I've said, call it out quickly, call it out in a zero tolerance way, support the rule change, of course, but also the hard work of changing the culture.
But do you think freedom of speech, a human right, has been abused in parts of the Labour Party, or certainly on the far left, when at the Labour Party conference, which I attended recently, there was a fringe event at which the chairman asked about the right to debate the Holocaust, yes or no. Now, I never did learn what the yes or no was. Yes or no, it happened or it didn't happen. Yes or no, it was a good thing or a bad thing. Yes or no, it shouldn't happen again. But that was done in the name of free speech. Should free speech allow that debate?
No, free speech has limits. It's always had limits. And those limits have to be adhered to. And Holocaust denial is off limits. Hate crime is off limits. We have criminal offences around hate crime, and we punish people through our courts for what they say and what they do. And that is a limit on free speech, which just goes to show that it's a qualified right to be protected and rightly protected, but there are limits, and that's the balance that has to be struck. And therefore the idea of complete free speech is inconsistent with a proper understanding of human rights, because when, going back to where we started, after the Second World War, the world came together to craft these rights, they deliberately decided that free speech would be capable of having limits. And then there are arguments about where the limits were, but nowhere in any human rights instrument is free speech an absolute right.
So is it being misused, do you think, in parts of the left to justify what many people would say goes further than legitimate criticism of the Jewish state of Israel for its policies regarding Palestinians, and bleeds into hatred of that Jewish state? Is the human right of free speech abused?
I think it's rare, but I think it's happened. And when it is happened, it's got to be called out. And I think that's across probably all political parties, sadly. It's across communities, sadly. But if it's in the Labour Party, it's got to be called out. But is it there? Is it real? Yes, absolutely it is. I mean, you know, but it is there more generally. I mean, just look at tonight. Everybody's bag was searched on the way in the synagogue in my constituency, just over the way. There's 24/7 security. There is, I think, at the synagogue just up the road here. That tells you something. It's evidence of something that is very, very real. And I was just talking to a colleague on the way here, asking the question, is there any other place of worship, place of meeting, where security is 24/7 all of the time? And I can't think of one. I can think of other communities where there are awful attacks. In mosques we've had to have it, again in my constituency at times, but it's usually been periodically in a time of heightened tension, but not always. And yet this security is always, and there's a reason for that. And therefore it is very real.
If we do go back to where we started and we think of why many human rights were developed and enhanced, why do you think there has been a rise in anti-Semitism? A rise in anti-Semitism reported here, even more extreme in France, for example, where there have been more visible attacks, and that it has reared its head on the left, whereas in the past it has almost always been the preserve of the far right. We've always worried so much more about fascism and its relationship to racism and anti-Semitism, and not on the left.
And it's a very difficult question, and I'm not sure I completely know the answer to it. I think the passage of time may be part of the answer, that as each generation goes by, what happened in the Second World War and in and around the Second World War becomes more and more remote. And that's why actually history and teaching about the Holocaust, which goes on in schools, is so important, because otherwise it is lost. And I've been really struck as I've grown up how things that I felt were, if not immediate, were sort of at least immediate history, are now so far removed from kids these days that they don't resonate in the same way. So passage of time possibly, I think, is a contributor. There is also the potential that we are now more open about the fact that it's happening than before. I mean, with all hate crime, and we did a lot of work on trying to prosecute hate crime when I was Director of Public Prosecutions, the number of offences was going up year on year on year. But it didn't necessarily mean that the number of offences was going up. It was that gradually people were beginning to have the confidence to come forward and tell other people what was happening to them. And hatred is a really horrible concept. And I had many cases where individuals wouldn't say what had been said or done to them because they thought it was because they were hated. And nobody wants to think they're hated. And so there's this barrier. And part of the challenge was, how do we actually give people confidence to come forward and report what is happening to them? So possibly, time, also possibly and hopefully that where there are instances of anti-Semitism, it is coming out more often and we can deal with it. And that actually needs to happen.
In a few minutes, I'm going to throw open the discussion, in fact, in about 2 or 3 minutes, to all of you, so get prepared. There are going to be mics coming round on either side, but I'm just going to not finish him off, but finish off with Keir Starmer to just go back to the issue of Brexit. You mentioned hate crimes. Today there was the report, I think, that said there'd been a spike in the number of hate crimes since the referendum. And actually, when you, again, look at the figures, there have been fewer prosecutions, actually, as a result, compared to the year before the referendum. Is there a danger of fuelling division in communities by focusing too much on recorded hate crime, people being more aware of it, in order to fill a political narrative on Brexit?
No. I mean, I was really struck by the spike in hate crime after the referendum. The sense that somehow some had believed that it was licensed to hate. And I was genuinely shocked. I mean, my constituency is Haven and St Pancras, it's Camden, it's just across the way. A very diverse community. And in Camden, the morning after the referendum, on every lamppost in one part of Somerstown, far-right stickers were put up. Every lamppost that very morning. And it was shocking that in Camden that could happen. And we had people breaking into mosques and throwing stuff around. It was a shocking instance of hate crime, which just went beyond anything that had been experienced. And that was happening all over the country. And we had a couple of debates in Parliament about it, where MPs were giving examples in their own constituency of that hate crime. So I don't think it's a political reaction to it. It really happened, and it was shocking, and we all need to call it out, whichever way we voted.
Going forward, do you think Brexit will be or could be reversed?
That's a fine question to throw.
Just before I open it up.
Article 50 is the exit provision from the EU treaty, and that has been triggered. And it's a 2-year period, at the end of which we leave the EU, and that's the 29th of March 2019. And the question I ask myself is it politically likely that there will be a reversal in that period? And I think the answer is no. And I think, and I hear Tutting, I voted to remain. I wanted us to remain.
And you still want us to remain.
But I accept the outcome. I accept the outcome of the referendum because I actually went around the country imploring people to vote, and I said it's real. There is going to be a decision, and it's going to make a real difference. And I couldn't intellectually look myself in the mirror the next morning and say, well, I might have told everybody it was real, I may have campaigned on the basis of real, and I'm going to pretend it isn't. I wasn't going to do that, and I think that is intellectually dishonest. And had it gone the other way, I'd have absolutely expected it to be honoured and respected. And I don't like the fact that some people have campaigned with anxious Remainers to suggest that something can happen before March 2019 that I don't think is going to happen. I think there's one thing to sort of suggest there's a different way forward. It's another to speak to people who are very anxious about what's happened, suggesting there's an answer. And I think it is perhaps really important for me to say that, because I've said it a number of times and I need to explain what I mean. For the Labour Party, we have tried to represent and be able to speak to and for both the 52% and the 48%. You can say, well, that's trite, etc., etc. And it was a very, very difficult year. But for 52%, I think if you truly understand why people may have voted to leave, and it goes back to the question of this sense of control and influence, not to respect that is profoundly disrespectful. And I have not, some people go down the line of saying let's have a real referendum on the real facts. Implication, we voted and we understood the lies, but other people were too stupid and didn't. And that is hugely disrespectful of people who voted leave because they thought it was the right thing for their family, their community, etc. And so not accepting the result is not just a technical question. It is actually hugely disrespectful of millions of people. On the other hand, I have a growing concern that the interpretation that the Prime Minister has put on Brexit is one that makes the 48% feel that they're being treated as if they have written themselves out of their own future. But in other words, having voted the way that they did, what they believe in no longer counts for a generation. And that is a very, very deep feeling which I completely understand. And somehow bringing those together is the challenge ahead. And I think we have to walk towards the challenge ahead. I don't interpret the referendum result as a prohibition on a future relationship with the EU that is based on the principles I believe in of internationalism, collaboration and cooperation. I will fight for that partnership, and I will reject any suggestion that the outcome prohibits us from having that close relationship on those principles with our EU partners for the next generation and for the lifetime of my kids.
Very profound. Now I can actually see the audience. Would you put your hands up if you would like to ask a question? And I just have a couple of requests. We might take them in batches of 2 or 3. Try and keep them quite short if possible, and say your name. Shall I just gather these 3 here because they're fairly close together? The 2 gentlemen there and the lady behind. The microphone, can you get the microphone to them? If you grab that and
sure.
Speak up.
Yeah, thanks very much. So I've got 2 Brexit-related questions, and I think you were right as well. So one is on the issue of unilateral guarantees for EU27 citizens here. And the more it looks as if negotiations are stalled, even on the 3 preliminary issues, which were tied together in a way which is not protecting of rights, because it ties them to the money, it ties them to Ireland. The more it seems difficult to get both sides to make those guarantees irrespective of the agreement. So do you think, on that level, in the withdrawal bill, it is possible or probable that we get the government to make the unilateral guarantees that it was unwilling to make before notification?
Okay.
And related to that, on the no-deal possibility, if Labour opposes a no-deal scenario, and if Article 50, Paragraph 3 suggests we leave on the 29th of March 2019 in that scenario without a deal, what does a meaningful vote on the deal means?
Okay, I'm going to cut you short there. Yes, gentleman next to you.
Okay. We heard you say that you think it's very unlikely we can reverse the decision on leaving the EU. However, my point is the extreme Brexiteers who want a really hard Brexit or no deal at all are a minority in Parliament.
Yeah.
And how can we ensure that a minority do not dominate what is a democratic institution?
I'm going to pass that to the lady behind you. Thank you.
Thank you for a very inspiring conversation. I would like to believe you, because I really respect what you've said, that human rights is making progress. But I see all around the world that it isn't. That there are countries where masses of people are vulnerable and their human rights not respected. You mentioned a change in culture, a change in the mindset of people. Would you say something about sovereign immunity, which is holding things up, as I see it, and responsibility to protect, which is very interesting and hopeful, but I see it aimed at leaders rather than at rock bottom, everybody's responsibility to protect.
Let's take those questions. Do you want to do the Brexit-related questions first of all, about guarantees for EU citizens' rights and the no deal? I want to ask you something specifically on that in just a moment. And
then human rights and protection.
Yes.
I mean, on EU citizens, I and Labour Party have taken a very, very strong stand on this. Within a month of the referendum, we called on the government unilaterally to guarantee the rights of EU citizens in this country. There are, as you know, 3 million plus EU citizens in this country. There's 1 million plus UK citizens across Europe. We cannot legislate for what happens in other countries. We can legislate for what happens in this country. And therefore it would have been perfectly possible for the government unilaterally to say, we owe it to people who are here in our country, who've made their life here. I hate the word contribute to, because actually they're their friends, their neighbours, they're part of our society. And we could have done that, and if the government had taken that up, they'd have got cross-party support and we would have had legislation in place. The government has refused to do so. And there are two bases, I think, for that refusal. The first is they are using people as bargaining chips.
And the EU aren't?
But just hear me out. I mean, the government says, no, we're not. But if you say we have a group of people in our own country to whom we have obligations, to whom we should do the right thing, but we won't until the EU does the right thing for an equally concerned group, you are using people as a bargaining chip, because you're not doing what you should do with one group until you get something you want with the other group. That is bargaining with people's lives, and it should be called out for what it is. And whether the EU are doing it or not, I don't care. Our government is doing it, and that's what matters. I think profoundly. The other thing the government said is, don't worry. These negotiations are going to be so straightforward. They're the easiest negotiations in the world. If I think I'm making this up, look at Hansard. This is what Liam Fox said, and David Davis. It's going to be so quick, so simple. You don't need to worry, because as soon as Article 50 is triggered, we're going to get agreement on this, and the anxiety will be gone. And it isn't. In my advice surgeries, pretty well every week I have EU citizens coming to me, really anxious still about their position. I have no doubt that UK citizens abroad are equally anxious. And here we are at the end of phase 1 without sufficient progress to move on, and so that anxiety continues. And I think that is wrong. I also think that if our government had unilaterally guaranteed the rights of EU citizens from the start, it would have set a completely different tone and approach to negotiation. And one of the biggest problems this government has created of its own making is being so belligerent and hostile in its approach to the EU. They are better now, granted, but in the early days, that notion of we don't need you, you need us, we're better off without you, you're lucky we've been members for as long as we have.
Right, so what about the meaningful vote on no deal?
Just on no deal, before we get to the vote, it's really important that we analyse what no deal actually means. No deal means we have not reached an agreement on anything. That means we haven't reached agreement on phase 1, we haven't reached an agreement on EU citizens. By March 2019, they're still anxious. We haven't reached an agreement on Northern Ireland. We haven't reached agreement on the money. Now, just the agreement on Northern Ireland, let's just take that. If we haven't reached an agreement on Northern Ireland, it means there's going to be a hard border. Because you can't have an open border between two countries that have not agreed what the rules are.
Do you really think that is realistic, though, Keir? I mean, nobody is wanting to have a hard border or any sort of division between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And isn't no deal much more about no free trade deal?
Well,
that not the fact that we might not get a deal on those other issues.
It is increasingly becoming wrapped up in these other issues, because if we don't get through phase 1 into phase 2, we're not going to get on to security, aviation, fishing, farming, you know. No deal means that we don't have any agreement in place about aviation or security, etc. So taken at its most literal, it is completely incapable of being supported by anybody who is rational about the future of this country. And therefore, of course, any MP would vote that down. I have no doubt that there will be many Conservative MPs who would vote that down, because the consensus of the House of Commons is not for that extreme version of Brexit.
So do we fall out of the EU at that point, or what is the UK status?
Well, it seems to me that, I mean, one, before we get to that, we should absolutely fight for transitional arrangements. And that is why I said what I did on behalf of the Labour Party over the summer about transitional arrangements. It's why the intensity of the discussion on Friday is what it is, because it's, in a sense, about transitional arrangements. Businesses are queuing up to tell me about their anxiety, about not having transitional arrangements. So before we even get down, people ask me hypothetically what we do with no deal. The first thing we do is we focus all of our energies on how do we use the political space available over the next few months to get the government to accept that transitional arrangements on the same terms as we've got now are absolutely essential for the future of our country. I don't want to get to a position where we get to no deal. If we do get to that position, I think it will be voted down in the House of Commons, and if it's voted down, there are very serious consequences for the Prime Minister, and rightly so.
Right, now, does that answer in any part the question? Okay. Right, I mean, in terms of the minority, briefly, because we do need to get some other questions, the minority of what the gentleman described as extreme Brexiteers.
Sorry, yes. We certainly shouldn't let the minority of extreme Brexiteers run the show, and they are running the show at the moment.
Well, is that a failure of the opposition?
It's a failure of...
The opposition?
No, it's a failure of the Prime Minister. It's a failure of the Prime Minister. This Prime Minister had a majority. She went to the country to try to extinguish opposition to what she was doing, and she came back with a minority. And it's put her in a completely weak position where she can't face down the Brexiteers in her own party. That is entirely of her making. And it's not the fault, I mean, on the opposition, we will vote against no deal, we will vote against these extreme measures. The question is not whether Labour votes it down. That's all very well. We lost the election. We could, even if we got 100% of Labour MPs and opposition MPs through the lobby on everything that matters, we will still lose unless sufficient number of Tory MPs join us. And that's the frustration of opposition. People keep saying to me, well, why didn't you win your amendments on Article 50? You know, what are you? What kind of a politician are you? Well, we didn't win our amendments because when we went through the lobby, there were less of us than more of them. And that's what happens in our Parliament. And so that consensus, the majority of MPs need to find their voice over the coming months and force the government to face up to the extreme Brexiteers. We need to do that loud and clear. We need to be joined across the House in that endeavour, and we will. I'm not denigrating people who believe very profoundly in the Conservative Party that what's being done is wrong.
I'm going to hurry you along, and I'm going to be quiet as well. Can you just answer the lady's question about human rights progress, sovereign immunity? In other words, people at the bottom, how do you change the culture of ordinary citizens rather than just the leaders of countries?
Yeah, I mean, look, if the test of whether human rights are a good thing is are there any breaches, then human rights can never win. They are universal standards. The extent to which they're enforced is going up and up, and the way they're being used in different countries is getting ever more sophisticated. I genuinely believe that is raising the floor, changing the way people think, and constraining some of what might otherwise have happened. Is it stopping all abuse of human rights? Of course it is, and there are most appalling examples of that. The question is, are the standards that the world is prepared to commit to and fight for, whether legally or through foreign policy? And I believe that's profoundly important. And I don't think we'd be better off if we simply abandon the whole project, say, well, it hasn't worked, let's not bother with them. There are no standards. Let's just do what we can politically where we see trouble. The fact you've got standards is important. We must just continue the battle to enforce them. I'm not a big fan of sovereign immunity. I think it's allowed... Sorry? On the responsibility to protect. I mean, very quickly, one of the big differences in the post-Second World War human rights instruments is that they are intended not just to protect the individual from the state, but to protect individuals from each other. Many individuals' human rights are abused not necessarily by the state, but actually by other people, as it were, horizontally. And there's been a lot of development of that. And I saw that for myself when I was working in Northern Ireland with the police over in Northern Ireland after the Good Friday Agreement, where the duty on the police and others to protect the lives of people is a very important living embodiment of the development of human rights, and a very, very important one.
More questions? Shall I take three in that corner and then I'll go to the other side? So, yes, the gentleman right there and then behind you and in front of you, please.
It's on human rights. News today that the Kurds who've overpowered ISIS are being expelled by the Iraqi army who've driven them out. It seems terribly unfair, inhuman, and unjust. What are your views on that?
Okay. Question one to the gentleman. Yes. Oh yes, behind first, and then we'll go to the gentleman in front. Yes.
Okay. I was just wondering what your view was on socio-economic rights as a subset of human rights, whether they can have legal protection within the Human Rights Act, or whether they shouldn't be just because they're so hard to obtain in practice.
And the gentleman, yes, there, with his hand up.
You said that culture needs to change in the Labour Party to call out anti-Semitism more vigorously. Given that culture is led from the top, what do you think specifically of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn, specifically in relation to anti-Semitism?
How do you take that first?
I mean, Jeremy has called out anti-Semitism, and he backed the rule change in the party, and is therefore championing the cultural change that I've advocated for. I know there are criticisms across different audiences of that, but the question is, when push comes to shove, and there was a rule change at this year's conference, did he back it or didn't he? And he did back it. And I think, but culture change is actually much bigger than one individual. It's much, much bigger than one individual. And no leader of the Labour Party can police every meeting of every ward in every constituency. We're all in a position to do that, myself included. We've all got to join in this endeavour and be absolutely serious about it.
But is there a problem with not leading by example? If you can't, as a party, expel Ken Livingstone, he's still suspended rather than expelled, and if you call out all racism, a little bit like President Trump calling out violence on all sides, but you cannot specifically say that anti-Semitism is unacceptable, that is a problem with leadership.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, on the Ken Livingstone expulsion, I immediately said he should have been expelled. I was very clear about that. The decision not to expel him was not that of Jeremy Corbyn. It was of a panel that was set up to look into what he had said and decide what should be done about it.
By Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, by Jeremy Corbyn, but if you set up a panel to do something, I mean, you can't then say, well, I'm going to walk all over you and overrule you. I mean, that wouldn't happen in any organisation. I've been in many organisations where you say, in relation to a particular problem, I'm going to set up a panel, ask them to look into it, and then to come to a decision. If you then say, well, if you come to the wrong decision, I'll overturn you because I'm the leader of the party, that's the wrong way to do politics. But but it is perfectly legitimate for leading politicians in the Labour Party to say, I don't think the panel got it right. And that's what I said. I think, faced with what the panel had decided, they should have expelled it. And I think lots of people said that, and they rightly said that. But we've just got to be careful, if we're really going to tackle this in the Labour Party, to make it a shared responsibility. And I've seen this so many times where it's so easy to sort of go after an individual, say it's all the fault of him or her. And usually that is intended to let everybody else off the hook. And that is a major mistake in my view.
He's conspicuous by his absence. He doesn't stand up and talk about anti-Semitism.
We will probably come to this again in the questions. So we'll just answer those two questions and then we can always go, no, it's absolutely fine. The other two questions, interesting question about the Kurds, and the Peshmerga are often seen as the great fighters against ISIS, and yet they themselves are now under pressure in Iraq or on the edges of Iraq.
Yeah, which is an appalling situation, and comes back to the question that's been raised a number of times about, is it legitimate to claim that human rights have changed anything or progressed in any way? And the answer is yes, because in the end, as these things happen across the world, wherever it may be in relation to whichever community it is, we need to have a yardstick by which we're measuring what's happening. We need to agree what the standard is. Otherwise, there's a complete vacuum. How do we actually judge X against Y? How do we call out and label what's happening? unless we've agreed as a community, a set of communities, what the standards are and what the rules are. And human rights is the framework that allows that to happen, and therefore, I do fundamentally reject this notion that human rights has added nothing to the world since the Second World War, because there are still human rights abuses going on. If that's the test, then you're not really giving human rights much of a run or much of a chance.
The socio-economic rights?
Socio-economic rights, I would, instead of having yesterday's argument about whether we give legislative form to civil and political rights, I would like to bank the Human Rights Act and all of its benefits and leave it untouched and go to a different debate, which was how do we do the same for social and economic rights? What's the apparatus that allows us to give them better protection? I'd much rather be focusing on that debate rather than arguing about yesterday's debate, which is about civil and political rights. How it's done is a profoundly interesting challenge. In South Africa, as you probably know, there have been attempts to put social and economic rights into some sort of statutory form, and it'd be well worth looking at some of the cases there to help us go forward. But I would rather be having the discussion, which is what is the next stage of human rights protection in our law, not how do we undo the stage we've just got to, which is where we're at the moment.
Questions? Yes, perhaps in the middle here. So that gentleman, and then the gentleman next to him, and then the lady in front.
Hi. I'm lucky enough to do some work with Renee Casal on modern-day slavery and learning about the importance of international collaboration in tackling horrific crimes such as this. And so I just wanted to know your opinion on prospects of future work with Europol and Eurojust in light of Brexit, and the likely impact that will have on our ability to tackle modern slavery and other crimes that transcend borders.
A question about the limits on free speech, referring back to the referendum here and the US presidential election. There's been a number of researchers showing that a number of overseas companies have influenced voting patterns, both on the referendum here and the US presidential election, by using social media, mass data and so on. A lot of these funded by very wealthy individuals overseas who are therefore not subject to the rules of our electoral commission about the limits on campaign funding. So in other words, it's a question about how our democratic process is being subverted, and I think it also opens up the wider question about what do we do about fake news, lies, and the kind of politics we're into.
Okay.
Is there any way of regulating that?
Okay, and the lady in front, and then we'll get...
I wanted to raise the issue of global climate change. The person before mentioned socioeconomic, and I don't hear in the Labour Party discourse the words climate change. I don't hear any emphasis on how critical it is. I'm concerned about the impact of Brexit on the very, what I see as weak cap and trade. At least there is some cap and trade attempts and other climate change attempts in the EU. I'm really concerned about all of that collapsing, and I'm concerned about not hearing the words climate global crisis in the Labour discourse.
I think we start with Europol, modern-day slavery, etc. The first thing to say is, sadly, modern-day slavery is here, and it's much more profound and widespread than you think. We're talking thousands of people, very often women and children, being trafficked across Europe. It's real, it's happening, and it's happening all of the time. And it's one of the most serious crimes that is on the rise. Europol and Eurojust are two of the European institutions that are trying to deal with that. When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I was part of Eurojust, and my staff were in Eurojust, and that was a place where we shared intelligence about gangs who were trafficking people, and we shared strategies about where they'd be intercepted and what would be done to prevent and to prosecute cases. As we leave the EU, then on the face of it, we leave both Europol and Eurojust. And one of the questions the government has not yet answered is how they make up for that gap. In one of the papers that the government put out over the summer on security, they acknowledged that no deal, and therefore being outside of some of these institutions, left gaps in the protection against very serious crime. And I think it is a real cause for concern. And people casualise it and say, well, it will be fine, we'll find a way. The trouble is there are too many bits that are going into the box of it'll probably be all right. I mean, David Davis's general approach to the whole negotiations is, look, I've done a couple of negotiations in the past when I was at Table R, and it'll all work out in the end. And there are too many bits going into the box of it'll probably all work out all right in the end. But that's a big box, and there's not much time left.
He speaks very highly of you, I must say. But it is fair to say that the government has actually rowed back on using security as a threat in the negotiations.
Good. Quite right, too.
So the next question was on limits on free speech in terms of how much our democratic process has been undermined by free speech allowing fake news and lies to be perpetuated online.
Well, there are two parts to that question. I think the first was about interference by possibly other states in the campaigns, and the second is about the whole fake news agenda. So far as any involvement of other states is concerned, obviously we have to protect the integrity of our system against that, and we have to have complete investigation into any allegations of that to know whether it happened, the extent to which it happened, and what we need to do to prevent it happening. What I resist myself is some of the argument that says it definitely happened and therefore we should not accept the result of this outcome or that outcome. I don't go that far, but we've obviously got to protect the integrity of our system. The fake news or the false things that are said, I think is much, much more profound. The casualisation of the truth that's gone on in recent months is really, really dangerous. When it no longer matters, when political campaigns are campaigning for an outcome, whether they're telling the truth or not, is profoundly important, is really, really important. And that's why that bus with £350 million the NHS on was so outrageous for everybody, whatever way they voted. The implication being that that was possible, was true, was a promise that was being held out, and it was a complete falsehood. And we must not be casual. Fight it out, have battles, slug it out, all you like. But once you say it really doesn't matter anymore whether you're even telling the truth, you're going down a very, very slippery slope, and we should all resist that.
And was that the same as the Treasury saying, and some of the Remain arguments, that we would suffer a profound economic shock in the immediate aftermath of Italy?
That was equally wrong.
Right.
And it was a big mistake as well, I think, because looking back on it, I think one of the things that was not done well enough in the referendum campaign was to say, what are the positives, what are the values behind the European project, rather than what are the dangers of leaving. And as I look back on it, it's easier now to see where the campaign went so very badly wrong.
And Jeremy Corbyn only gave the EU 7 out of 10, I seem to remember at the time. The lady who asked about why Labour isn't making more of the threats of global climate change, whether when we leave or even when we're still a member of the EU.
Well, I think that in almost everything we've said on Brexit, we have always said that the environment is a central concern that has to be dealt with as we go through the process of leaving the EU. One of the things the EU has given us is a collective way of dealing with threat to the environment in all its different manifestations. So I'm not sure it's fair to say we haven't said that loud and clear. It's certainly there in our manifesto. I will say this, and it's not so much about the Labour Party, but it is important. I felt that up until the crash at the early part of this century, there was much more focus, or beginning to be much more focus, on climate change, on the environment. And we began to go down the road of legislation about this. Then we had the crash, and my own sense is that for a number of years, that meant that the focus came off the environment and climate change because everybody said, how do we mend the economy? which became the understandably pressing issue of the day, but all political parties were so focused on that they took their eye off the climate change environmental ball. And I think Brexit is the opportunity to come back to it and to put it very much back on the agenda.
We've got time for one more question. Where is it? Oh, there. Yes, you've got it. Sorry, you've got
Thank you for a fascinating conversation. Growing up, I felt like one of the worst violations of human rights in this country is the indefinite detention of tens of thousands of migrants. And I'm interested, what do we do to fix it? And does Brexit provide an opportunity that we finally need?
The indefinite detention of migrants is wrong in principle and should be ended and should have been ended by now. And it will be ended one day, and when it is ended, we'll look back and say, how on earth did we ever allow it to have happened in the first place? There is a huge difference between detention for a fixed period and indefinite detention on the human soul. And indefinite detention is wrong in principle. I've called it out, Labour Party's called it out. Increasingly across the House of Commons, people are calling it out. It will end. It's just a question of when it happens, and it has to happen.
Right, I'm afraid you've still got one more minute. So this lady here, because you're a pin in my eye line, this will be the final question.
Hi. My question relates to Brexit. Very simple. How can the Anna Soubrys, the Nicky Morgans, and the like of them be enabled, encouraged to vote with their consciences? And just on the back of this, I would like personally to thank you for all you have done in relation to Brexit. I think we all know the work that you've put in.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, you know, there's no doubt that all political parties have differences within their parties on the question of Brexit. And there are very obvious reasons for that, but I certainly felt from the Labour Party point of view it's very important, slowly but surely, to move the whole party in the right direction rather than simply going out with what I thought and having different voices within the party saying different things. So one of the things I tried to do this summer was actually get the whole party to a developed position on our policy as a party. I mean, it is not easy for Anna Soubry and Nicky Morgan, Dominic Grieve, all of whom I respect. Dominic Grieve was Attorney General when I was DPP for 3.5 years, and I worked with him very closely for 3.5 years, and I've got the greatest respect for Dominic Grieve. But it's not easy, and we need to understand that, because the position they find themselves in is that they've got a minority government, and if they vote against their own government, they risk toppling it. And that is what they are getting very loudly in one ear from their own party machine. And we would get the same if it was us. This is not something about the Conservative Party. In the other, of course, they do believe in the national interest. And as Dominic has said on a number of occasions, there has to come a point at which the national interest trumps party interest. And how they manage that over the next few months is going to be obviously a matter for them. I hope they are able to manage it in a way which is in the interest of the national interest, because that is what is at stake, and we all have to act in that way. They have to, and we have to. And the role of the opposition at the moment is absolutely to, on the one hand, challenge the government for, frankly, the mess it's making of this, but also to wish them success in a successful negotiations and in the national interest. So whatever the short-term gain for the Labour Party in this government screwing it up, if they screw it up, they screw it up for everybody in this room, everybody in this area of London, everybody in the country, and for the next generation. And I don't want the short-term political gain at that cost. And therefore, we and Anna Soubry and Nicky Morgan and Dominic all have to recognise that the job is to challenge, point out what's wrong, but also to act in the national interest. And the national interest at the moment for me is getting ourselves onto transitional arrangements so that we don't go over a cliff, to allow the political space for the much bigger discussion, which is what actually is the future relationship with the EU, and how do we ensure that the referendum is not treated as an extreme severance, meaning that we can't have our values embedded in whatever the relationship going forward. We've shared a history with Europe, we've shared values with Europe, we continue to share values, and we should share a future. We've got to fight for that.
Is it the prospect of short-term political gain that made Jeremy Corbyn change his mind then on Brexit from being a leaver to a remainer?
I mean, Jeremy's always said that he voted Remain, and knowing Jeremy...
Do you believe him?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. I mean, in different people you see different characteristics, but honesty is one of Jeremy's characteristics.
Rubbish.
Is one of his characteristics, and I do not believe that he would have said he voted Remain last time if he didn't vote Remain last time.
Right.
But just hear me out, because I'm not entirely friendly audience on Jeremy, and it never is when I'm in an event like this, and I understand that. But be fair and judge what you see. I have, I hope, given some shape to what Labour's opposition is over the summer and got a clear position. That has been done with Jeremy, not against Jeremy, and so Jeremy has given me the space to develop Labour Party policy in the way that I've done it. It's slow, I accept that, it means trying to keep all the party on board, but I honestly think that this portrayal of Jeremy as an entrenched Eurosceptic who is not capable of thinking about what a post-referendum policy should be is not actually fair. And I think we all owe it to him and to all of us to just watch what's happening and keep a more open mind. I could not have developed the policy in the way that I've been able to do so if Jeremy was not open to me doing it. And therefore, we have to see that in the mix. And people's positions on Europe pre the referendum are obviously important. The more important question for me is what's your position after the referendum about what the future relationship is. And that's the fight we're in. I want to fight today and tomorrow. I don't want to fight yesterday.
Thank you very much for being such a lively and attentive audience. I can't see anyone asleep at this particular point. But please, again, thank Keir Starmer for a very nice
Joe for a really engaging and informative discussion, and we're really privileged that you're here with us tonight. I'm Simone Abel, I'm a trustee of René Cassin. I've been involved with the organisation for about 8 years now. I'm very proud of the work it's doing. And, about 8 years ago when René Cassin first developed this campaign to protect and promote the Human Rights Act, we were seen as a fairly unusual fringe organisation because people were saying, the Human Rights Act won't be taken away from us. And it's been really fantastic to see the work that's been done by you, Keir, by a whole range of politicians to try and protect this Act. And listening to you speak about how the Act has been under attack essentially from the beginning really reminded me why we should be galvanised into action to protect the Act, irrespective of Brexit, irrespective of world events, because actually, who better to be the guardians of the Human Rights Act than a community that has suffered egregious human rights abuses throughout the course of history. So I hope you will all join us. There's materials about René Cassin outside at the front, and please go onto our website and have a look and join our events to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights next year. And join us in celebrating the legacy of a really remarkable human being, René Cassin, arguably one of the founders of modern human rights. And hopefully we will see more of you. And thank you for coming, and thank you to JW3 for hosting us. who's kept us technically going all evening, and Nicola, who's done this amazing job on stage text.